we do indicate that if the electricity constraint were to be alleviated, we could add to growth by as much as 1 percentage point, because then we'll be able to supply the necessary energy to our manufacturing, our mining sector. But at the same time, just the mere fact that that would show an environment that works, there wouldn't be headlines transmitted to the rest of the world of energy outages, rationing of energy. That would, of course, impact positively on confidence and could contribute positively to private sector investment, which is currently fairly low. Now, of course, we have seen many currencies depreciating over the recent past, including our own. But of course, what matters for real gains from a currency depreciation is the real effective exchange rate, the exchange rate adjusted for inflation, and insofar as it relates to the countries with whom we trade. Whilst the currency has depreciated somewhat, but on a real effective basis, some of that has been eroded by the fact that relative to our trading partners, our inflation has been somewhat high. One of the main messages of this slide is the fact that we need stronger actions, and those must happen swiftly to overcome these domestic constraints, to improve the competitiveness of our economy, for us to be able to make a dent on the main challenges that we face of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Now, some of these actions are identified on this slide. I won't repeat them because we've touched on them, but you can see they relate to speedy execution of infrastructure to unlock the growth potential of the economy. They relate to dealing with the labor relations environment to make sure that it is stable so that there are no protracted disruptions in production on the one hand, but at the same time, the world does not receive news from our shores that talk about labor instability and whatever other negative consequences that it might have, which would then impact on investor confidence. It also talks to improving the regulatory environment and the efficiency and effectiveness with which we as authorities execute those, so that if for any reason there is an amendment to a piece of legislation, change in regulations, it's done very swiftly rather than being in the system for extended periods of time, thus leaving or sustaining uncertainty, so to speak. In recent times, growth has shown some weakness, and of course, the revenue too has correspondingly shown that weakness. In the focus that the minister unveiled yesterday, we show that revenue for this year has been revised down, fiscal year that is, by 7.6 billion, owing to a substantial revision in corporate income tax and value-added tax to a certain degree. So the upshot of this is that, which is a refrain that the minister repeated a couple of times yesterday, if we are to expand expenditure, we would need more revenues, and for us to have more revenues, growth has got to accelerate. The base that we tax must expand. There is only so much that you can get in the form of revenues from tinkering with both the structure and the rates in the system. Countries get the biggest boost in their income revenue, that is from expanding bases, because that makes life quite easy. Of course, the processes that are underway led by Judge Davis in the committee that was announced a couple of years ago to look at whatever reforms can be brought about to make our tax system more efficient, to make it more progressive, whilst, of course, taking into account our developmental ambitions and so on. Now, we do emphasize in the policy statement the fact that no decision has been made on VAT. It would have been obvious, of course, in the numbers. It is a matter that the Davis Committee is also looking at. But the most fundamental point we make about the entirety of this tax system, including looking at VAT, is that it is very important not only to look at taxes and the progressivity thereof. It is important to look at the entirety of the fiscal system, the progressiveness of the entire fiscal system. In other words, where does expenditure go? After the taxes have been collected, yes, you can express an opinion on them, but who benefits from the expenditures? And then you can have a full appreciation of the progressivity or otherwise of the system. Of course, in this slide we show that in the past, if you look at the black line there, revenue growth was quite high, steep, aided in large part by growth in GDP. It actually was above expenditure, non-interest expenditure, that is, expressed as a percentage of GDP. So in those years, we had a lot of room to do wonderful things, give people tax breaks, accelerate expenditure on capital, which we saw rising from under 5% to just under 10% during that period. But of course, when the crisis hit us around 2008-9, you then see those two lines crossing, and non-interest expenditure exceeded revenue by a significant proportion. It is very important to close the gap between these two if we are to place our fiscal accounts on a sustainable footing. And you can see that the dotted parts of that graph do indeed reflect the closing of that gap. Of course, there is a risk to this insofar as the wage settlement is concerned, which I referred to earlier on, because it is in fact inflation linked. Very importantly, on the next slide, we show that the commitment that we had made in February, or shall I say, repeated in February, of stabilizing debt as a percentage of GDP. We show here net debt stabilizing. If you look at the graph beyond that vertical dotted line, although it is still on the upward trajectory, but towards the outer years or the end of those lines, there is indeed stabilization. Of course, there are changes in the slope relative to what we showed in February, where the stabilization happens now at a slightly higher level and a little later than we originally projected. But the fiscal objective of stabilizing the debt is, insofar as this graph shows, stabilizing. The Minister talked yesterday to the new guideline, not a rule as yet, which seeks to anchor fiscal management. Yes,